the part of him that saw the snake wasn't the part that was doing this. There's a part of him that does this to snakes. That's what it does, and it's way faster than you figure to see the snake, you have to, the image is obviously the image. The pattern is portrayed on the retina, it propagates backwards. To see it, it has to be elaborated up through a very complex set of neurological connections. That takes time. And so you're dead. Well, the thing that snake means this, that's like 3 neurons, super fast. And so what is a snake at that level of representation? It's like a snake is that which makes you do this. And then you could also say that at that level of representation, everything that makes you do this is the same thing, right? Because the same would be defined by the pattern that you manifest in response to that entity. So then your nervous system is layered, that's sensory layer, neurological layer, motor layer. As you become more complex, the sensory layer differentiates into the different sensory systems, and the neurological level multiplies in terms of its potential number of connections. So what happens is that you can map patterns that manifest themselves in multiply different ways to multiple motor outputs. So you start with a fixed action pattern, which is just like the sponge reflex. What's the world to a sponge? The world is what makes you go like this or like that. That's it. That's the whole world. The sponge has compressed the entire world into pores open, pores closed. That's it. 2 states. And then, well, once the nervous system gets differentiated and the senses get differentiated, so there's specialized kinds of cells, then you can detect more forms of patterns. You can produce more patterned output to that. But even more interestingly, and this is where the nervous system starts to come into play, the mapping of the pattern onto the output is no longer one-to-one. You can use the same pattern, roughly speaking, to produce all sorts of different outputs that are context dependent, because you might say, well, so, okay, I picked that up. You say, well, he picked that up. It's okay, well, what about that? You think, well, he picked it up. Well, yeah, I did, except the pattern of musculature that I used to do this is by no means identical to the pattern of musculature that I used to do that, right? I mean, the fact that the orientation is different is actually extraordinarily important. So well, my point is that with sufficient nervous complexity, you can take the same thing, so to speak, and map it all sorts of different ways, and human beings are unbelievably good at that. Okay, so now go back to when things were simple. So there's single-celled organisms, we'll say, and then they start to differentiate to some degree, and they start to propagate, and so then the environment starts to shift, because the fact of the prevalence of all of these competitors means the environment isn't exactly the same as it was when that system first evolved. New problems emerge, and so then there's selection pressure on those creatures to diversify to some degree, and then the diversification produces a transformation in the environment, and then there's pressure on those new entities to diversify some more, and so you get this weird bootstrapping process. Maybe the environment is one thing when there's 10 of you, but a completely different thing when there's 1,000 of you. Right, so just sheer multiplication is going to transform the environment, and so then because the environment has now become more complex than it was, there's selection pressure to produce diversification in the underlying organisms, and that took a long time to get off the ground. Like, there were single-celled organisms for a huge span of history. I mean, if you look at evolutionary history, the amount of time that there were single-celled organisms is far longer than the time that there's been since there were multi-celled organisms. It's like Moore's law, you know, the law that governs the increase in computational power. You can trace that back to about the year 1400, something like that. So it's been going on for a very long time. And maybe you could make the same case from an evolutionary perspective. It's like the flat part of the curve is really long, but once it starts to move up, it starts to move up really fast. And obviously that's the position that we're in now. So single-celled organisms for a long time. Then they started to diversify. And then you could imagine, well, from the single-celled organism, you start getting multicellular organism, and then it ends up with this tripartite structure: sensory layer, nervous layer, motor layer. And then that starts to differentiate. And every time there's a differentiation, that's conserved. And that's these systems, the motivational systems. They emerged a long, long time ago as emergent solutions to emergent problems, and you've conserved all of them. I mean, you've conserved your snake reflex, which is like 3 neurons long. So that's really, really primordial. But you've conserved function at almost every temporal level. So there's parts of you that are quick and dirty, and parts of you that are slow and sophisticated. And a lot of the contents of consciousness is slow and sophisticated. So it can't help you out in an emergency. But it can do, what consciousness seems to do is take your structure, it analyzes the worlds for, let's say, mismatches between what you want and what's happening. And then it either helps you alter the world so those mismatches go away, or it turns inward and modifies the structures that you're using. So if you're playing the piano, you've got this automatized routine. It has very little to do with consciousness if you've practiced enough, and you make a mistake. You stop, and you note the mistake, and you stop, and then you slow it down, and then you practice the new thing, and then you speed it up, then you speed it up, then you speed it up. And as you're doing that, the neural representation shrinks until you've developed this little specialized machine, and then you run that a few times, and now you can ignore it. You can look at the notes and just play, and away you go. And that's kind of what consciousness is doing all the time. You're laying out an automatized routine, and then if that doesn't produce the intended outcome, you stop, you become conscious, really, because there's nothing like an error to make you conscious. Then you do a high-resolution analysis of the space in which the error emerged. You rematch your motor output, your perceptions and all of that to make that error go away, and away you go. And so your consciousness is your consciousness seems to be continually building your unconscious, your procedural unconscious. And so to some degree the purpose of consciousness is to make you functional unconsciously, right? Because that's way better. You don't want to be conscious of most things because it's just, what are you going to do? Be conscious of your digestive processes? It's like, no. If you're good at something, you hardly have to be conscious of it at all. So consciousness is something like an error detection and rectification system, something like that. And so you can say, well, you could practice being conscious, because what that means in some sense is you're always attending to your errors. And that seems to be a really intelligent thing to do if you don't take it too far and collapse yourself. Because if you're always attending to your errors, you're always improving your automated adaptability. Something like that, right? Pay attention. See if things are working out the way that you want them to. And if they're not, modify your approach, your perceptions. Okay, so you've conserved these systems. And the systems emerge to solve the problems of emergent complexity. And you end up at birth with all of these conserved systems. And so those would be proclivities that would enable you to manifest the necessary realm of behaviors in the social, natural, human environment. Something like that. So you're basically prepared for that. And we went through what those were last time. And you can break them down into self-maintenance motivations and self-propagation motivations, something like that. So, okay, now the question is, how do those manifest themselves? And that's where we can make a shift, say, from evolutionary ideas and biological ideas to narrative ideas. So, I've made the case for you that you exist within this thing. I've never figured out exactly what to call it, because you can call it a game, or you can call it a frame of reference, which is a pretty good one, or you can call it a story, or you can call it a unit of perception, but that's not exactly right, because it's more than perception. It's really what it is a micro-personality. It's your personality as it manifests itself at the highest possible resolution. That's what this is. And so if I'm, say I set myself the task of moving those keys from there to here. So my perceptual frame it's this thing. I think, well, what's the world? Everything else can be ignored. I need to make an object out of my hand, these keys, that tiny spot on the table. And my goal is to transform this pattern into that pattern. And it's a pattern because maintains itself across time, right? It's not like smoke or a cloud. It persists. So there it is, there it is, there it is, there it is. That's a pattern that's extending across time. So I have this goal, which is the transformation of this into that. And that goal, so that would be, roughly speaking, the goal is point B. But you can't just think about this as something that's a goal, because it isn't just a goal. There's a goal, which is the end state of this entire process. The end state is, I've moved the thing from here to here, I've transformed this into this, and I've done it using action. And that's a useful thing to know too. I have an abstract notion, that's my decision, that I'm going to get the world to manifest this pattern instead of this one. Okay, so that gives me my target. That's an abstraction. But when I actually do the transformation, that's not an abstraction, because now I'm using actual action, actual behavior. And so I take this abstract micro-personality, this is the part that's operating on this tiny little section of the world, I make the transformation, and as soon as I do that, another thing happens, which is I don't need that anymore, right? I move to the next one of those, whatever it happens to be. And so one of the things we're going to have to figure out is, what is the relationship between these things? Because you're always in one of them, and they're scalable. It's like when you're doing a specific action, it's really high resolution, and that's kind of where you want to be operating. When you know what you're doing, that's where you want to be operating, roughly speaking, when you're trying to do something new, but it's scalable. And so the framework, which is constructed in part from these motivational systems that emerged over evolutionary history, the framework specifies the current condition, the desired condition, and the behavioral manifestations that are necessary to make the transformation. And so you can't think about it as a drive, because instincts are often thought about as drives, or as a goal. It's not correct, because the thing actually determines your perceptions. It determines what objects manifest themselves to you in the world, or what patterns. That's another way of thinking about it. Because like when I'm looking at this, it's hard to watch your own perceptions. But when I'm looking at this, I can see that chair, but if I didn't know it was a chair, I wouldn't be able to tell by looking by my visual input. I can kind of see this one, although I really can't tell what color it is. That one's slightly clearer. This is pretty blurry here. Like I can't see my fingers if I'm looking at the keys. I can't see my fingers unless they move. And I'm very, very focused on that. So what happens is that all the rest of the world turns into a low resolution representation that vanishes on its periphery. The resolution increases as I move towards the central part of my visual field. And here it's sharp enough so that I can actually see the letters on that key. So my desire, which I'm indicating by the point of my eyes, is specifying the objects that I see and specifying their level of resolution. So you can't just call that a drive or a goal. That's not right. It's the mechanism that makes the world manifest itself to you. So that's a unbelievably crazy thing, is that the world manifests itself to you in keeping with your goals. Now that doesn't mean that you can make the world do any old thing, because it pushes back, right? It objects to you. So, but still, it's a very strange thing. Okay, so fine. So it specifies your perceptions, your target, the current reality, and the likely procedure that you're going to use to make all of that interrelated. But it does more than that. So we're going to look at it from a couple of different perspectives. So the classic and archaic way of thinking about perception is the world's full of objects, you see the objects, you think about them, you evaluate them, then you act on them. It's like, no, that isn't how it works. First of all, the world is not made out of objects. The world is made out of, I think the world is made out of tools and obstacles. And it's because you can't not perceive the world in relationship to you. And what you perceive actually are the meaning of objects. You perceive the patterns. A tool is something like a meaningful pattern or a useful pattern. It's something like that. And so look, again, you look at, I might say to someone, describe this room. Now you're going to pick a level of description that's very particular.